The sun was going down behind the jungle trees when they heard the trucks rumble in. The boys, barely old enough to shave, were lined up on their knees, arms bound, faces smudged with ash and fear. Their captors spoke English, laughed loudly, wore hats like something from an American movie. One boy, maybe 13, whispered, "They're here to kill us." His lip bled from a fall. Another began to pray, not to be saved, but to die quickly. Then the Americans got closer, but instead of rifles raised, they held bags. And inside, hamburgers, still warm, thick with grease. One soldier knelt and unwrapped one with a grin. "Eat, kid," he said. "You're not going to die today." The boys stared, uncomprehending. The smell hit first, then the warmth, then the shaking hands reached out. No bullets, no barking orders, just food and eyes that didn't look like monsters. This was not surrender. It was something more disorienting. Kindness. They had no word for what was happening. No training manual had prepared them for mercy. In the final months of the Pacific War, when the sun burned white over the Philippine jungle and the empire's grip crumbled into ash, Japan's last defense was not men, it was boys. They were pulled from schoolrooms and street corners, handed rifles that dragged at their shoulders, and fed stories of heroic death. Die before you're captured. Bite your tongue off before you speak. Hide a grenade in your shirt and pull it when the enemy gets close. These weren't metaphors. They were instructions. The youngest was 12. He still carried a pencil stub in his breast pocket and whispered math tables under his breath at night, as if they might protect him. The oldest was maybe 15, already hardened by hunger and the blur of shell fire. Their unit had fled inland after the Americans landed, deeper into the jungle, leaving the weakest behind with a final command, "You know what to do," which meant don't get captured, which meant die. But dying turned out to be harder than they'd been led to believe. The small group of abandoned boys took shelter in an abandoned hut near a dry riverbed. They dug shallow foxholes with trembling hands. They boiled weeds into bitter broth. And they waited for an enemy that had been painted in their minds as devils, monsters, cowboys with blood on their teeth. For years, the Bushido Code had been drilled into them like gospel. Surrender was not just cowardice, it was filth, a rot that would stain your family name for generations. To die for the emperor was glory. To live in captivity was disgrace. These ideas hadn't come from their own minds, but from the mouths of teachers, officers, posters plastered across train stations. A soldier without honor was no better than a dog, and so these boys clutched their weapons, slept in shifts, and tried to imagine what death would feel like. But something stranger happened first. The jungle fell quiet. The last messages from command stopped coming. The older boys guessed the war was over, or near enough, but no one said it aloud. Saying it made it real, saying it made surrender an option, and they weren't allowed to want that. By day, they patrolled the forest's edge, peering through brush with eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. By night, they whispered about what might come. One said he'd heard the Americans peeled skin off prisoners. Another said they forced captives to dig their own graves. No one argued. The cruelty seemed believable, expected, even earned. What no one said, not even in whispers, was that part of them hoped it would be quick, that they were tired of pretending to be brave, that they hadn't seen their mothers in 2 years, that they missed rice and warmth and the sound of someone calling them by name. They didn't have language for those feelings anymore. War had replaced them with slogans. And still they waited. The oldest among them, a boy called Kenji, though they had stopped using names much, had a fever. His arm was infected from a cut. He tied a rag around it and kept watch through gritted teeth. Another boy, Yuto, tried to find roots to boil. His feet were blistered from weeks of marching. At night, they listened to the far-off rattle of gunfire and the low drone of American bombers sweeping the horizon. When the sound of trucks finally came, it was almost a relief. They gathered in the clearing, filthy, skeletal, gripping rusted weapons they barely had the strength to lift. Some cried, quietly, into their sleeves. One boy put the muzzle of his rifle to his chest, but the chamber was empty. Another offered him the last match, as if that was mercy. They knelt on the damp earth, surrounded by jungle shadows, and closed their eyes. They did not pray to be saved. They prayed not to scream. They had waited for execution. But what came instead, what came next, would unravel everything they thought they knew. It began with the sound of engines, first low and distant, like thunder buried beneath the trees, then louder, a cough and grind of machines not made for jungle roads. The boys stirred from where they crouched among the brush, their bodies tensed, eyes wide. No words, only breath and heartbeat. One boy clutched a stick shaped like a rifle. The real one had been lost to rust. Another dug his fingers into the dirt, as if he could anchor himself to the earth before it all ended. They heard barking, dogs close now, then voices, English, shouted back and forth with a rhythm they didn't understand. Laughter even. Was it a ritual before killing? They didn't know, but it sounded cruel in its casualness. And then, the boots. Heavy steps crushed the undergrowth, slow and sure, not frantic, not afraid. That made it worse. You only walk like that if you're confident no one can hurt you. The boys shrank deeper into the foliage, backs pressed to trees, breath held like coins. A branch snapped. A shadow passed. Then the boots stopped. And out from the path emerged a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a hat straight out of a movie, wide-brimmed, dust-covered, cocked slightly to one side. He had a square jaw, sunburnt skin, and a lazy gait like he'd just stepped off a horse instead of a troop truck. Behind him came others dressed the same. Some wore bandanas, others chewed toothpicks or spoke in deep, drawling accents that bent English into something slower, thicker. To the boys, they looked like cowboys. Not soldiers, cowboys, and that made no sense at all. The man raised a hand, not with a weapon, but with a paper bag, grease-stained, steam curling from the top. The smell hit first. Meat, salt, bread. The youngest boy cried out and slapped a hand over his own mouth. Another began shaking so hard his teeth knocked. Still, no one moved. One had already tried to die, pressing a sharpened lid to his throat just hours before. Now they waited for the real blow. But it didn't come. The cowboy, that's what they called him later, even when they learned his name, knelt down and pulled a wrapped bundle from the bag. A hamburger, the kind they had seen in drawings, never in life. Round, fat, glistening with grease. He said something, slow, soft. They didn't understand the words, but the tone. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't even impatient. It was casual, like he was talking to kids. He set the burger on the ground, unwrapped it. Then, to their astonishment, he took a bite himself, chewed, swallowed, grinned. "See?" he said, gesturing toward the rest. "Ain't poisoned." The boys didn't move, but their stomachs clenched. One hadn't eaten in 3 days. Another had resorted to chewing tree bark. The scent was unbearable. The cowboy laid the burger down carefully and stood. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, the others following, leaving a trail of food behind them. It wasn't an ambush. It wasn't a trick. It was lunch. The oldest boy moved first, crawled on hands and knees, eyes darting. He touched the burger like it might explode, then he tore off a piece and shoved it into his mouth. He gagged, not because it was bad, but because it was real. Too rich, too much. The others followed, slowly, greedily. Shame and hunger tangled together. Some cried as they ate. One boy laughed, a high, broken sound that startled even him. No one understood what had just happened. The Cowboys hadn't conquered them. They'd fed them. And nothing in the world made sense anymore. They sat in the dirt with grease on their lips and silence in their mouths. No one knew what to say. The smell of meat still hung in the air, thick as fog, curling into their hair and clothes and memories. One boy clutched his half-eaten hamburger like a relic, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the foil as if it might vanish. Another picked at the sesame seeds on the bun, afraid to bite again. They had been told stories, that Americans would peel skin, that they wore teeth around their necks, that they laughed as they burned prisoners alive. They were raised on images of the enemy as a monster in uniform, faceless, merciless, inhuman. But the man with the hat had smiled, and the burger had tasted like home, even though none of them had ever eaten one before. This wasn't war. It was something worse. It was kindness. The soldiers didn't shout. They didn't bark orders or wave guns. They handed out burgers the way uncles handed out candy. One of them, a young man with freckles and a soft drawl, even tousled a boy's hair before moving on. The boy flinched. Sure, it was a trick, but the hand was gentle, and then gone. None of this was supposed to happen. Kenji, the oldest, tried to make sense of it. His fever had broken, and the swelling in his arm had gone down, thanks to an ointment given by one of the medics. But he still felt like he was floating, as if the world had turned sideways and no one had told him. He chewed slowly, forcing each bite down like it might betray him. This food wasn't just nourishment, it was an assault. On his training, on everything he'd believed. He remembered his instructor in Manchuria, a bitter old veteran who had once said, "The Americans are dogs. They would sooner cut your throat than look at you." Kenji had believed him. Why wouldn't he? The man had scars across his face and missing fingers. He spoke with fire and certainty. And now Kenji sat in the shade of a tree, eating American beef on American bread, served by American hands. He looked over at Yuto, who had devoured his burger in seconds and was now licking his fingers with wide, stunned eyes. "Why?" Kenji whispered. Yuto shook his head. "I don't know." Another boy said, "Maybe they want us fat before they kill us." No one laughed, not because it wasn't funny, but because it might be true. Still, they kept eating. Hunger overruled fear. That was the cruel part. Their bodies didn't know ideology. Their bellies didn't understand shame. They only knew empty and full, pain and relief. And this food, this moment, was relief. One boy, too weak to hold the burger, was fed by a medic who crouched beside him and tore the meat into small pieces. The boy cried through the chewing, tears mixing with grease, dripping down his chin. The medic wiped his face with a napkin. It was the gentlest touch the boy had felt in years. Later, they were given water, blankets, and a space beneath a tarp strung between trees. The soldiers didn't chain them, didn't scream at them. They were watched, yes, but not like animals, like children. And that broke something inside, because cruelty had rules. You could hate cruelty, you could resist it. But this generosity was a different kind of weapon. It didn't destroy the body, it unraveled the soul. As night fell, the boys lay together in the warm hush of the jungle, bellies full for the first time in weeks. Some whispered to each other. Some cried quietly, some stared at the stars, unable to sleep. Kenji lay awake, staring at the foil wrapper clutched in his hand. The hamburger was gone, but the shame was only beginning. By the time the sun rose the next morning, they were on trucks, open beds rumbling down a dirt road carved into the side of a hill, the sea glittering just beyond the tree line. The boys sat shoulder to shoulder, silent, fingers gripping the wooden railings. No one tried to run. Where would they go? Back into the jungle? Back to the hunger? Better to wait and see what this strange kindness would demand. The trucks brought them to a temporary prisoner of war camp near a quiet coastal village. It didn't look like a prison. It looked like a school that had been forgotten by the war. There were canvas tents, some wooden barracks, fences, but no towers, no dogs, no shouting. When they stepped off the trucks, a man with a clipboard gestured them into a line. Another man, younger, carried a stack of folded clothes, shirts, trousers, even socks. The first boy handed a set, blinked at it. He hadn't worn socks in months. They were led into a bathing tent, stripped of their rags, and gently, almost awkwardly, ushered toward warm water. A bucket of soap sat in the corner, and one of the guards pointed to it, miming scrubbing. The boys didn't move. Then Yuto, ever the brave one, stepped forward, picked up the soap, and pressed it to his chest like it might burn him. By nightfall they were clean, dressed in American-issued garments that didn't quite fit. The sleeves hung past their wrists, the pants bunched at the ankles. They looked like children playing dress-up in their father's clothes. They didn't know what to do with comfort. A medic examined their wounds. One boy had a gash along his calf that had gone black around the edges. The medic spoke softly, then cleaned it with practiced hands. Another boy, head crawling with lice, was given a comb and something that smelled like menthol. No one yelled. No one struck. Still, the boys flinched with every movement. They braced for pain, for mockery. But none came. Later that day, a soldier tossed a baseball glove toward Kenji. It landed in his lap with a soft thump. He stared at it like it was some foreign weapon. The soldier made a throwing motion, then pointed at a boy with a ball across the yard. Kenji didn't move. The glove stayed there, warm from the sun, unused. Nearby, Yuto kept saluting, not to mock, but out of confusion. Every time an American passed, he stiffened, hand raised. The soldiers chuckled quietly, but not unkindly. Eventually, one of them returned the salute, crisp and exaggerated, and Yuto nearly fell over with the shock of it. They still didn't speak the language, but words weren't needed. The gestures were clear. Sit, eat, rest. And slowly, the boys began to obey, not out of fear, but out of something else. The strangest part was how the Americans looked at them, not with hatred, not even with pity, but with the casual recognition reserved for kids. The way a camp cook ruffled Yuto's hair, the way a nurse offered Kenji a small tin of ointment and said, something with a smile, like a mother tending a scraped knee. They weren't seen as enemies. They weren't even seen as soldiers. They were just boys. And that truth, that unbearable truth, unraveled them more than the hunger ever did. Because if their captors could see them as children, what did that make the men who sent them to die? It was the first time any of them had been given paper since the war began. A clean sheet, lined, folded in half. A pencil with a sharpened tip. One of the soldiers, a translator maybe, explained it with soft gestures and careful words. Write to your family, we will try to deliver. The boys stared at the paper like it was a riddle. Some refused to touch it. Others picked it up and immediately set it down again, as if it might catch fire. A few clutched it tightly, folding and unfolding the corners until they tore. No one wrote, at first. What could they say? They had grown up reciting loyalty to the emperor before they knew how to spell their own names. They had bowed to portraits, memorized speeches about glory, and been promised that death in battle was the greatest honor. They had believed that, with everything they had. And now they were clean, fed, warm, alive. It didn't fit. Kenji was the first to try. He sat under the edge of the tent one evening, the pencil shaking in his hand. He wrote slowly, every stroke deliberate, like the words might betray him if he wasn't careful. He didn't begin with "Dear Mother." He didn't know if he had the right. Instead, he wrote, "I am alive. I am warm. The enemy gave me food. They gave me medicine. I do not understand the war anymore." He paused, looked at what he had written. Then, in tiny letters beneath it, he added, "Please forgive me." He never signed it, never sealed it, just folded it twice and tucked it into his pocket. He would read it over the next few days, silently, lips barely moving, but he never handed it in. None of them did. The Americans didn't ask why. They just kept offering more sheets. They brought more pencils. But the pile of collected letters remained small. Most of the pages stayed blank, because to write home meant admitting something had changed, and none of them were ready for that. Yuto watched Kenji read his letter one night and asked, "Will your mother understand?" Kenji shook his head. "Would yours?" Yuto didn't answer. The war had taken more than their bodies. It had claimed their identities. They had been child soldiers, warriors in training, patriots. Now they were, what? Prisoners? Survivors? Boys again? The camp had rules, yes, curfews, inspections, patrols, but it was nothing like what they had expected. There were no whips, no screaming, no cages. There were cards to play, books to try reading, soap every few days, hot meals, and space to think. For the first time, they had hours that weren't filled with orders, time to sit, to wonder, to remember. Some cried at night, quietly, not from pain, from confusion, from memory. A few began to talk about home, not in declarations but in fragments. A mother's cooking, a sister's singing voice, a dog that used to sleep under the porch. It hurt to remember, because remembering meant admitting you wanted to return, and wanting to return meant surviving, and surviving meant disobeying everything they'd been taught. Kenji once asked a guard, "Do you think we're cowards?" The man looked at him, not angry, not mocking, and said, "No, I think you're boys." Kenji didn't reply. He turned away and stared at the sky. That night he tore his letter into 4 small pieces. He buried them under the cot. It was easier not to speak, not to explain. Easier to stay quiet and keep the truth folded inside like paper that no one would ever read. But silence was fragile, and it couldn't hold back the sound of music. The harmonica started one night after lights out, a low, wavering note drifting through the camp like fog. The boys sat up in their cots, not sure if it was real. Then came another note, then a melody. Not military, not threatening, just music, strange and soft and sad. Across the yard, American soldiers gathered around a small fire. Some sat on crates, others on overturned buckets. One held the harmonica to his lips, eyes closed, swaying slightly. Another strummed a guitar, poorly but with conviction. A third tapped his boots against the dirt in rhythm. It was the sound of something unguarded. Some boys turned away. Others watched through the canvas flaps. Kenji sat up and stared, frowning, trying to understand. These were enemies, and yet they laughed with their mouths open. They leaned on one another. They sang off-key. They looked, impossibly, like older brothers. The next morning, one of the soldiers, a freckled boy barely older than Kenji, brought over a baseball and mimed throwing it. Yuto, curious and half awake, mimicked the motion. The ball sailed past him and rolled into the dust. He picked it up, tossed it back. They played catch for 10 minutes. No words, just throws. Another soldier offered Kenji a comic book, Captain Marvel, with bright colors and flying punches. He didn't understand the English, but the drawings were clear. A boy who could turn into a hero. He flipped through it slowly, page by page, as if searching for instructions. These weren't tactics. They weren't interrogation. They were moments. And the boys didn't know what to do with them. At first they assumed it was a game. Softness before cruelty. A trick. But it kept happening. The music at night. The glove passed around after lunch, a soldier whittling a toy bird out of wood and handing it to the smallest boy without ceremony. It chipped away at their armor, not the physical kind, that was gone the day they laid down their weapons, but the armor in their minds, the shell of ideology, of loyalty, of hatred passed down like inheritance. Kenji began to dream strange dreams. He dreamed of his commander back in Luzon, the one who told him that Americans were beasts, who slapped him for crying, who screamed that death was purity. In the dream, that commander stood silent while a cowboy offered Kenji a hamburger. He woke up sweating, angry, confused, because what did it mean if the enemy was kind? If the enemy fed you, played music for you, treated you like a child and not a criminal? It meant everything he had been taught might be a lie, and that was more terrifying than any gun. One night, Yuto whispered, "They laugh like us." Kenji nodded. He had noticed. Another boy said, "Do you think they have mothers too?" No one answered, because they knew the answer, and that answer cracked something wide open. Their commanders had been cold, distant, obsessed with glory. They had screamed about the emperor, but never asked the boys if they were afraid. They had taught them how to die, but not how to live. These soldiers, these boys in foreign uniforms, didn't speak their language, but they shared stories through gestures, through firelight, through tunes bent and pulled from a harmonica in the dark. And for the first time, the boys began to ask themselves, what if the enemy had more mercy than the men who led us? It was a question they didn't know how to answer, but the music played on, and still, some of the boys flinched at every note. As the days passed, a few began to soften. They ate meals without darting eyes. They fell asleep without clutching their knees. Yuto even laughed one afternoon, chasing a baseball that bounced wild across the yard. Kenji started shaving slivers off a stick, whittling it into a shape he didn't yet recognize, just for something to do with his hands. But not all of them changed. There was one boy, his name lost, or maybe never spoken, who sat in the corner of the tent with his knees drawn to his chest, eyes hollow. He hadn't said a word since they left the jungle, not once. He didn't eat unless food was placed directly in his hands. And even then, he chewed like it was a sin. A soldier once offered him a blanket during a sudden rain. The boy stared at it for a long time before pushing it away. "I am not allowed to be warm," he whispered. No one knew how to answer that, because kindness didn't erase memories. It couldn't scrub out the nights spent hiding in the mud, waiting for death. It didn't undo the orders screamed into their ears, the rituals of obedience, the drills where failure meant fists. They were no longer in a war zone, but the war hadn't left them. Each boy carried it differently. Kenji tried to talk to the silent boy once. He offered half a comic book and a piece of bread. The boy didn't respond, just stared through him like a ghost. Kenji sat beside him anyway, not speaking, just existing in the same space. It was all he could offer. That night, another boy woke screaming. It wasn't the first time. He cried out in the dark, arms thrashing, shouting words none of the Americans understood. But the others did. It was the name of his brother. The guards rushed in, panicked, thinking it was an escape. But when they saw the boy curled on the cot, sobbing, they just stood there. One of them knelt down and put a hand on his back. The boy didn't stop crying, but he didn't pull away. These were the moments that fractured the illusion of safety. Because survival came with its own torment. They were alive, yes, fed, sheltered, but alive in a world where death had been promised as destiny, and that made their existence a kind of betrayal. Not to the Americans, not even to their old commanders, to themselves, to everything they thought they were. Some of them began to split, not outwardly, but within. There were boys like Yuto who adapted, who clung to the new world like it might save them, who learned to smile again, however cautiously. And there were others who couldn't. They still bowed too low, flinched at sudden sounds, refused to touch soft things. Kenji felt caught between them. Some days he laughed at jokes he barely understood. Other days he woke with tears on his cheeks and didn't know why. The Americans tried. They really did. They brought crayons, magazines, even a deck of cards one afternoon. One soldier taught them to draw stick figures. Another made animal noises to coax a smile. But healing doesn't happen on command. One boy dug a small hole behind the tents and filled it with rocks. No one knew why. When asked, he said, "I am building a grave for the part of me that died." No one laughed, because they all understood. Not all wounds bled. Some just whispered, night after night, in the spaces between meals, between silences, between songs. They had been soldiers. Now they were boys again. But the ghosts, the ones that followed them through the jungle, through the surrender, through the music and meals, those never left. They lingered even as something new was placed in their hands. One morning, just after breakfast, a soldier motioned a few of the boys toward a patch of ground behind the camp kitchen. It wasn't much to look at, a rectangle of hard earth, trampled and pale, littered with pebbles and cigarette ash. One boy was handed a small paper packet. Another received a dented watering can. The soldier crouched, pressed his fingers into the dirt, and mimed planting. Then he pointed to the sun, then to the water, then to the soil again. "Grow something," he said, slowly, as if the words themselves needed time to take root. At first, the boys didn't know what to do. They stood awkwardly, unsure where to kneel, unsure whether this was work or punishment or another test. Kenji opened the packet and stared at the seeds. Tiny, dry, unimpressive things. How could anything living come from something so small? Still, he knelt. He pressed his fingers into the dirt. It was cool beneath the surface, softer than it looked. One by one, they placed the seeds into the ground and covered them gently, as if tucking them in. The watering can passed from hand to hand, its weight awkward, unfamiliar. Water splashed unevenly, mud stained their cuffs. No one shouted, no one corrected them. And that was the strangest part. They returned to the patch each day. At first nothing changed. The dirt remained stubborn and flat. A few boys lost interest and wandered off. Others came back anyway, kneeling silently, staring as if waiting for proof that this wasn't pointless. Then, one morning, Yuto spotted it. A sliver of green, barely visible, pushing through the soil. He called out, his voice sharp with disbelief. The others gathered around, crouching low, afraid even their breath might harm it. It wasn't much, but it was alive. Something shifted then, quietly, without ceremony. They began to tend the patch with care, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Kenji found himself waking early to check on the shoots before breakfast. Another boy pulled weeds with delicate fingers. The silent boy, the one who had refused the blanket, sat nearby one afternoon and watched. He didn't touch the soil, but he didn't turn away either. The garden didn't erase the war. Gunfire still echoed in the distance some nights. Rumors still drifted through the camp, of fighting, of surrender, of cities burned to the ground. The war wasn't over yet, but something inside the boys had already ended. They were no longer just surviving. They were choosing to care. That mattered. The plants grew slowly, leaves unfurled, stems strengthened. Watching them rise felt different from everything else that had come before. This wasn't food handed to them. It wasn't music drifting in from someone else's hands. This was something they had started, something that answered their attention with growth. Kenji realized one afternoon that no one had saluted in days. No one had barked an order. No one had spoken of honor or death. They worked in silence, side by side, dirt under their nails, the sun on their backs. They weren't soldiers here. They were boys tending a garden. In those moments, dignity returned, not loudly, not triumphantly, but gently, in the way they stood up straighter, in the way they shared the watering can without being told, in the way the silent boy finally reached out and touched a leaf, just once, as if to make sure it was real. Kenji watched him do it and felt something tighten in his chest. This small act of nurturing was something no commander had ever taught them. No drill had prepared them for it. And yet it felt more human than anything they had done in uniform. They didn't speak of the future. They didn't ask what would happen when the war ended, or where they would go, or whether their families would recognize them. They focused on what was in front of them: soil, water, light. And for the first time since the jungle, the ghosts grew quieter. If you're still here with us, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and tap like if you think stories like this deserve to be remembered. But not gone. The war ended in August. No fanfare, no parade, just a radio in the guard station crackling with the voice of an American general announcing Japan's surrender. A few soldiers raised their eyebrows. One let out a low whistle. In the POW camp, the boys didn't cheer. They stood in silence as the news filtered down through translators, hand signs, uncertain phrases. It's over. Japan has surrendered. You're going home. Home. Some didn't react. Others looked at each other, confused. One boy muttered, "Where is home?" as if the word itself had been misplaced in the rubble of their minds. Yuto sat down and stared at the dirt. Kenji folded his arms. Neither spoke. The Americans began preparations for repatriation. Trucks arrived. Supplies were loaded. Lists were read out. Names checked. Gear counted. The boys were handed travel papers with strange stamps. A few were offered toothbrushes and socks. It was all happening too fast. One boy refused to pack. He held tightly to a dog-eared comic book, its cover faded and worn from being read 100 times. He'd held rifles and grenades before, but now he held this, with the same desperate grip. The American soldier who had given it to him tried to smile. "Keep it," he said. The boy nodded without meeting his eyes. Some of the boys asked if they could stay. It wasn't a joke. They said it quietly, carefully, ashamed. They didn't want to go back to cities turned to ash, to families they weren't sure had survived, to a country that might not understand why they had lived. One boy whispered, "If I return, will they think I failed?" Another said, "Will my mother still call me brave?" There were no answers. The Americans did what they could, gave them clean clothes, folded letters, cans of food for the road. As the sun dipped low, they were called to the trucks. Kenji hesitated before climbing aboard. He turned, looking back at the camp, the tent flaps, the garden behind the kitchen, the dusty baseball glove someone had left hanging from a nail. A soldier walked up and handed him a hamburger, still warm. It was a gesture, nothing more. But Kenji took it with both hands. The others were handed the same. And so they sat in the trucks, side by side, chewing slowly. No one spoke, no one needed to. The taste was familiar now. The soft bun, the smoky meat, the strange tang of pickles, a last meal before crossing back into a world they no longer recognized. One soldier, the same one who had played the harmonica, stood beside the truck as it rumbled to life. He raised a hand in a loose salute, not military, just farewell. Yuto raised his in return, and that was it. They didn't cry, they didn't wave, but something had been left behind in that camp, something they hadn't known they were allowed to have. Dignity, not in glory, not in death, but in survival, in friendship, in the quiet bond between enemies who had stopped seeing each other as enemies. As the trucks pulled away and the sky turned orange, the boys looked out over the trees. Somewhere beyond them lay a country changed, a home they would have to relearn. But in their pockets were comic books, letters never sent, and the memory of music in the dust. They were not the same boys who had crouched in the jungle weeks before. They were not soldiers anymore, just sons going home. Years later, some of them would speak, not to the press, not in loud declarations, but in fragments, over shared tea, in hushed conversations with a grandchild curious about an old scar or a folded letter that never made it to a postbox. Others never said a word. The war remained a sealed box, heavy but untouched, yet even in silence, the truth found its way out. It lived in dusty notebooks tucked inside drawers, in journals no one else was meant to read, in single sentences that slipped from aging mouths when no one was asking. That once, when the jungle trembled with fear and death seemed certain, they were met not with bullets, but burgers. And something changed. The memory clung to them, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was impossible, because it didn't make sense, because no one had prepared them for kindness. The moment a warm hamburger was pressed into their dirt-stained hands, the world they thought they knew fractured. It didn't shatter all at once. That would have been easier. Instead, it splintered, slowly, painfully, like ice thawing under a hesitant sun. The taste of meat and mustard haunted them longer than the sound of gunfire, because mercy, once received, becomes a ghost that follows you. Not in torment, but in gentle questioning. Why did they feed me? Why didn't they kill me? Who was I, if not a weapon? And what now? Dignity, they discovered, doesn't vanish after war. Once touched, once offered, even briefly, it takes root. For some, it returned quietly, in the way they would later raise their own children. Not with the rod, but with stories, not of glory, but of confusion, of warmth, of a harmonica played under foreign stars. Others could not forgive so easily, not their commanders, not their country, not even themselves. But even then, the memory of that moment remained untouchable, a piece of humanity preserved in the ashes. As decades passed, history swept over them like another storm. Japan rebuilt, America moved on. Wars came and went, but in the quiet spaces between anniversaries and textbooks, the story lived on. Imperfect, incomplete, but undeniable. A story of boys who had been told to die, and instead were fed. A story that began with terror, stumbled into grace, and ended not with victory, but with understanding. It wasn't a political story. It didn't fit easily into parades or national myths. But it mattered, because it proved something dangerous and beautiful, that even in war the enemy can be kind, and when you are fed by the hands you were trained to hate, you do not become weak, you become human again. Some of the boys, now men, then elders, would pause when they walked past the smell of grilled meat on a summer day, not with hunger, with memory. Some would look at a comic book and feel their chest tighten. Others kept the baseball gloves, the seed packets, the letters they never sent. They didn't need to explain. The meaning was not in the objects, but in what they survived. And what they learned, that the world is not black or white, it is broken, tender, complicated, and that sometimes all it takes to unmake a war, even for a moment, is a stranger kneeling in the dust and offering you food. Not all of them healed, but none of them forgot. Thank you for being here. If this story moved you, give it a like and let us know where you're watching from. These stories deserve to be remembered.